The cemetery was on the east side of the city, which meant the wind came off the lake and there was nothing between it and the grave. 14 people in a rough semicircle. 14. I counted twice, because I had nothing else to do with my hands, and my mind needed somewhere quiet to go. His name was Walter Greer. He had lived across the hall from me for 4 years. He had been in the building for 11. He was 63 years old, and he ate badly, and he never exercised, and his heart stopped on a Wednesday morning, and that was that. Natural causes. The coroner signed off in 40 minutes. I found out about the 40 minutes later, and I have been thinking about it since, because 40 minutes is not very long to decide that a person's death is unremarkable. 12 of the 14 people at the grave I recognized. Mrs. Okafor from the second floor, who baked things and left them outside her door on Fridays. The Hendersons from 5C. A small cluster of people I assumed were former colleagues. They had that particular way of standing near each other without quite touching, the way people do at funerals when they have not seen each other in years, and do not know yet if this is a reunion or just a formality. His neighbor on the other side, Mr. Park, who was 91 years old and had known Walter longer than any of us, and who stood the whole ceremony without leaning on anything, which I admired. The other two I had never seen before. A man in his 50s, a dark coat, standing slightly outside the shape of the group, and a woman beside him. She was perhaps 60, perhaps less. It was hard to tell. She was wearing dark glasses even though the sky was entirely overcast, and she was looking at the coffin, not glancing at it, not looking at it the way you look at a coffin, which is briefly and then away, at the sky or your shoes or the person beside you, because coffins are difficult to look at for long. She was looking at it the way you look at something you need to confirm is really there. The whole ceremony. 37 minutes. I know it was 37 because I counted those too, quietly, seconds becoming minutes in my head, while the minister said the things ministers say, and the lake wind moved across all 14 of us, and somewhere on the other side of the cemetery, a lawnmower ran, and then stopped. She never looked away. Everyone said it was his heart. Of course it was. He was 63, he lived alone, no family in the city, he ate badly, he never exercised. These are the conditions under which men die of cardiac arrest in their apartments on Wednesday mornings, and no one finds them until the smell reaches the hallway, which was not what happened here, but the template was the same. Of course it was his heart. That's what happens to men like that. I almost believed it. I almost believed it because believing it was the simpler thing, and I am someone who prefers simpler things when they are available to me. But then I thought about the knock at 11 p.m. 3 days before he died, Walter Greer knocked on my door at 11 at night. He had never knocked on my door before, not once in 4 years of living 3 feet of plaster and insulation apart from each other. I opened the door, and he was standing there in the hallway, with his hands in his pockets and his face arranged into something that was trying to look casual and was not quite managing it. He said, "I need to ask you something, but I'm not sure I should." I said, "You can ask me anything." He said, "Maybe tomorrow." And then he went back across the hall and his door closed, and I stood there in my doorway for a moment, and then I went back to what I was doing, which was working, because I work in the evenings, and he had caught me in the middle of something, and I told myself I would check on him the next day. There was no tomorrow for Walter Greer. There were technically 2 more tomorrows, Thursday and Friday. But Thursday I did not check, and Friday I had a deadline, and Saturday I was going to knock on his door, and I did not. Because by Saturday morning, Mrs. Okafor had found the building manager, and the building manager had called whoever you call, and a man who knocked on my door at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday to tell me something he was not sure he should say was already in the hands of the people whose job it is to remove the dead from apartment buildings in an orderly way. That is where this story starts. At a grave in the east part of the city, watching a woman I did not know stare at a coffin for 37 minutes without looking away. Holding in my head the thing Walter Greer almost told me and did not. Understanding, standing there with the lake wind on my face, that I was possibly the only person at that funeral who knew he had been afraid. Let me go back. Let me tell you about the 4 years before the knock, because without them, the knock is just a knock. I moved into 4A in late autumn, which meant my first real impression of the building was winter light coming through windows that faced north and a radiator that clicked when it was going to do something and groaned when it had already done it. The apartment had an alcove off the main room, just large enough for a desk and a shelf, and I had wanted an alcove like that for years. The rent was more than I had been paying. I signed the lease anyway. My name is not important to this story. What I do is, I translate. Primarily technical documents, contracts, regulatory filings, legal materials, from German and Dutch into English, occasionally from English into either. I work from home. This means I spend a significant amount of time in a relatively small space being very precise about what words mean, which is relevant later. When I say I notice things, I mean, I notice things the way a person notices things whose entire professional life depends on the gap between what is said and what is meant. The building is on the older side, 6 floors, 32 units, elevator with a mirror in it that always makes you look slightly ill. The kind of building where people nod in the lobby and learn each other's first names only when something has gone wrong. In 4 years, I learned Mrs. Okafor's first name when the pipe under her kitchen sink burst and she knocked on every door on the 2nd floor. The Henderson's last name from the package that got delivered to me by mistake. Walter's first name from the buzzer panel downstairs, which listed tenants by first initial and last name, and his was listed as W. Greer. And the W stood for Walter, because he told me so in the laundry room, which I will get to. The wall between 4A and 4B is not thick. I knew this within a week of moving in, because I could hear the television. Not what was on the television, just the presence of it, the murmur of voices and occasional music, the specific shift in ambient sound that meant someone 2 feet away was awake. Walter watched the news at 7. After 9, something with a laugh track. I could tell from the rhythm of the silence between the sounds. By 11, the television was off and the apartment went quiet. This became the background texture of my life. Not intrusive. I want to be precise about this. It was not intrusive in the way sounds through thin walls can be intrusive. It was more like weather. A low-level awareness that there was someone on the other side of the plaster, living his evening in the same building as my evening, and that his rhythms were consistent enough that when they changed, I would probably notice. I am someone who notices when rhythms change. Professionally, this is an asset. We spoke in the elevator. That is where building people speak when they have no particular reason to seek each other out and no particular reason to avoid each other either. Weather. The building management, which had a habit of sending notices about things that never got fixed. Once, when the elevator was out for 3 days, we commiserated in the stairwell, and he said something dry about how buildings of this age considered a working elevator aspirational rather than functional. And I laughed, and that was approximately the depth of our relationship for the first 3 years. He was a contained person. That is the most accurate word I have for it. Not cold, not unfriendly, contained. He occupied the space he was in without overflowing into adjacent spaces. He nodded. He answered direct questions directly. He did not volunteer. I respected this because I am also, by temperament, a person who does not overflow, and there is a particular ease in being around someone who is also not expecting you to. The laundry room is in the basement. 6 machines, 3 washers and 3 dryers, a folding table with a chip out of one corner, a bench along the wall that has the particular quality of a bench that has been sat on for decades without ever becoming comfortable. The light is fluorescent and flickers slightly when a dryer is running, which is not optimal. 6 months before Walter died, I was down there on a Sunday afternoon, late. The building empties out on Sunday afternoons. People doing errands, visiting family, whatever people do when they are not at home. I had the room to myself for maybe 20 minutes before Walter came down with a basket and loaded a washer and sat on the bench. We talked for 20 minutes. Real talk, not elevator talk. I think the emptiness of the room contributed to it. There was no one else to diffuse the conversation toward. No one else's presence to perform normalcy for. Just 2 people waiting for machines, and the particular honesty that comes from having nowhere specific to be. He told me he had been an accountant. corporate finance primarily. He retired at 58, which was earlier than planned. He said it in a way that closed the question of why, so I did not ask. He had been in the building since he was 52. 11 years, which put his arrival several years before mine. He said it suited him because the neighbors left him alone, that nobody asked questions. He said that last part, nobody asks questions, with a quality I registered at the time as contentment, the relief of a person who had found a place where he could be unremarkable and preferred to be unremarkable, a man who had chosen quiet deliberately. I understood that. I have made similar choices. He laughed twice during that conversation. The second time was at something I said about a document I had spent a week translating, a regulatory submission of spectacular opacity, the kind of legal language that exists specifically to mean nothing clearly while appearing to mean something very carefully. And I had a specific frustration with it that I expressed probably with more energy than the setting required. He laughed at that, a real laugh, warm, the kind that reaches the eyes. He looked at me with what I can only describe as genuine warmth, the kind you see on someone's face when they are surprised by a person and pleased by the surprise. I walked back upstairs thinking, I should talk to him more. I never really have. I should. I never did. Life moves forward, and the specific intentions you form in laundry rooms do not always survive contact with the week that follows, and then the week after that, and then one Tuesday evening he knocked on my door and said, maybe tomorrow. And then there was no tomorrow. The funeral was on a Thursday. I wore a dark coat, took the bus, stood at the edge of the group because I was not family and not a close friend, and I needed to be there, but I was aware I did not precisely belong there. The minister spoke, the lake wind came and went. I counted to 37 minutes and watched a woman I did not know look at a coffin as if she was making certain of something. I took the bus home. I went up to the 4th floor. The elevator opened and I stepped out, and the first thing I saw was the building manager, a man named Gareth Marsh, standing outside the door of 4B with a locksmith. The locksmith was already packing up his tools. He had a canvas bag, and he was folding something into it with the practice speed of a person who does one thing all day and does it efficiently. The door to 4B had a new lock. I could see it from where I stood. Different hardware, different finish, newer. Gareth saw me and smiled. A completely normal smile, the kind you give to someone you see regularly in a context that requires acknowledgement. He said, "Afternoon." He said it in that easy building manager way he has, and I said, "Afternoon" back, and I looked at the new lock, and I said, "Is everything all right?" He said it was building policy. Vacant units get rekeyed for security. He said it the way people say things that are policies, with a particular flatness, a quality of, this is a procedure, and procedures do not require further discussion. I said that made sense. I went into my apartment, I closed my door, and then I sat down on the floor next to my door. Not on a chair, on the floor, which is not something I do. And I sat there for a while, and I thought about building policy. 4 years in this building. I knew of 2 other tenants who had died here during that time, Mr. Kanan on the 3rd floor, 2 winters ago, and a woman named Elizabeth, whose last name I never knew, up on 6, the previous summer. I did not attend either of those funerals. But I was in the building in the days after both deaths, and I remembered those days with a particular clarity now, standing in my mind's eye in the hallway after each one. No locksmith. No Gareth with a canvas bag and a new lock. Just the closed doors of apartments whose occupants were gone, unaltered, waiting for family to arrive and do what family does. Maybe the policy had changed. Maybe I had missed it with the others. Maybe there was a reason I didn't know. I told myself these things in a specific order, the same order, the order that leads toward reasonable and away from the other thing. I am very good at this. I have been doing it since the funeral. I am running out of maybes. I worked that evening, badly. My current project was a set of regulatory compliance documents for a Dutch pharmaceutical company. Dense, technical, requiring concentration I did not have. I kept stopping and looking at the wall to my left and listening. The television would not be on tonight. The television would not be on again. What was on the other side of that wall now was a room where a man had lived for 11 years, and a new lock, and whatever Gareth Marsh or whoever he worked for needed to have taken care of before the family arrived. The family. I realized I did not know who his family was. A brother he had mentioned somewhere. Estranged. I did not know a last name for the brother. I did not know how to reach anyone. I was across the hall from a dead man's empty apartment, and I knew almost nothing about the person who had lived in it, and the one thing I knew, the unfinished thing, the maybe tomorrow, was lodged in me like a piece of a sentence I could not complete. I put my work away and went to bed and did not sleep well. In the morning I made coffee and stood at my window and thought about the funeral. The man in the dark coat. The woman with the dark glasses who did not look away. They were not from the building. They were not former colleagues. They did not stand in the building colleagues' way. They were not family in the sense of people who were grieving, because neither of them was grieving, or if they were, it did not show in any legible way. They were there to see something. That is what it looked like from where I stood. They were there to confirm something, and then they left before anyone else did, quietly, together. And I did not see a car, and I did not see which direction they went. I thought about what he had said in the elevator 6 months before he died. The elevator opened on the 4th floor, and we had gotten on together in the lobby and ridden up in the particular silence of elevator rides that are almost over, and he had said, just before the door opened, "Do you ever feel like someone has been in your apartment when you were out?" I had said, "No, why?" He said, "Just a feeling." The elevator opened. He got out. I stood there a half-second longer than necessary before following. At the time I had thought, old building, he is probably imagining things, the way people who live alone sometimes project anxiety onto spaces. He did not seem especially anxious. He seemed like a person stating something he had observed, as you would state that a window was loose or a drain was slow. A factual note. I stood at my window with my coffee, and I took that sentence apart the way I take sentences apart professionally. Do you ever feel like someone has been in your apartment when you were out? The grammar of feeling rather than knowing. Not someone has been, but feel like someone has been. He was describing a sense, not a certainty, a sense strong enough to ask about, to share with the nearest available person, careful enough to frame as a feeling rather than a fact. A person who has been in his home for 11 years knows what his home feels like. If something had changed, if something had been moved, if some residue of presence remained that he could not specify but could register, he would know. He would not know how he knew. He would call it a feeling. I put my coffee cup down on the windowsill and I thought, how long had he been having that feeling? 3 days later, I went to the funeral home. I want to be clear that I did not have a plan when I went. I am someone who acts on evidence, not instinct, and what I had was not yet evidence. It was accumulation. The rekeyed lock, the strangers at the funeral, the elevator sentence, the knock at 11 p.m. These were things that sat together in an uncomfortable way, but that did not form anything I could point to and call a conclusion. I went to the funeral home because I had been thinking about the man in the dark coat for 3 days, and I had no better place to start. The funeral home was on Clement Street, one of those establishments that has been there long enough to have the furniture to prove it. Dark wood, muted carpet, a smell that was trying to be flowers and not entirely succeeding. The woman at the reception desk was perhaps my age, with the particular manner of someone who has learned to be calm in the presence of other people's distress. Not cold, just steady. I said I was a neighbor of Mr. Greer's and that I was sorry I had not had a chance to speak with his family. I asked, as casually as I could manage, whether the family had handled the arrangements themselves, or whether the building had been involved. She said the arrangements had been handled quickly. She said this in the way people say things that they find slightly noteworthy, not with any particular emphasis, but with a quality of reporting a fact that stands slightly outside the normal pattern of facts. I asked what she meant by quickly. She said the arrangements had been paid for before the family was contacted. She seemed to find this slightly unusual. She did not say so explicitly, but she mentioned it in a way that suggested it was the kind of detail that stays with you, because it does not quite fit the usual sequence of events. I asked who had paid. She said she couldn't share that. I said, "Was it the building?" She looked at me for a moment. Not a long moment, maybe 2 seconds. Then she said, "I really can't share that information," which is not the same as no. I thanked her and left. I stood on the sidewalk outside the funeral home and I thought about what I had just been told and what I had not been told, and where the line between them was. Someone paid for Walter Greer's funeral before his family knew he was dead. I have turned that sentence over in my head for a long time now. The only 2 categories of person who pay for a funeral before the family knows are 1. Someone who loved the person very much and needed to do something before the grief became inaction. Or 2. Someone who needed the person in the ground before anyone started asking questions about how they got there. Walter Greer had a brother he did not speak to. He had building neighbors who nodded in elevators. He did not have people who loved him so much they moved before the grief became inaction. He was, as I have said, a contained person. Contained people do not accumulate that kind of love. I walked home. I passed a coffee shop and went inside and sat in the back and opened my laptop and searched his name. There was not much. An old company listing, an accountant at a financial firm. A brief mention in a trade publication from years back. Nothing recent. No social media, which did not surprise me. He did not seem like a social media person. A brief obituary notice, presumably placed by whoever arranged the funeral, which gave his age and the date of death and nothing else. No surviving family listed. And then, because I know how to search, and because I know where to look when standard searches do not produce what you need, I searched his name in conjunction with certain regulatory databases, public filings, complaints submitted to oversight bodies, the kind of material that is technically accessible to anyone who knows how to access it, but that most people never think to look for, because most people do not spend their working days extracting meaning from regulatory documents. I found it on the 3rd try. His name, attached to a complaint submitted to a housing and financial oversight body 18 months ago. The complaint concerned the ownership structure of a residential building. It was 4 paragraphs, formal in language. The language of a man who had spent his career in corporate finance and knew exactly how complaints of this nature should be worded. It referenced specific financial instruments, specific irregularities in how funds were being routed through the building's management structure, specific concerns about who ultimately held what interest, and whether that holding was properly disclosed. He had been an accountant. He had lived in this building for 11 years. He had, at some point in the previous few years, found something in the structure of the building's finances that was not what it was supposed to be, and he had filed a complaint. The complaint had been assigned a case number. The case number led to a follow-up record. The follow-up record showed the complaint had been closed 4 months later. Reason: complainant withdrew. I looked at that for a long time. Complainant withdrew. Walter Greer, who had knocked on my door at 11 p.m. to tell me something he was not sure he should say, who had filed a formal, careful, 4-paragraph regulatory complaint about the building where he lived, who had been, for months, apparently sitting on knowledge he did not know what to do with. That Walter Greer did not withdraw. I was certain of this the way I am certain of things in my work, not from feeling, but from the internal logic of the thing itself. A person does not file a formal complaint and then knock on his neighbor's door late at night to say he needs to tell her something if he has already decided to withdraw. The withdrawal was filed on his behalf, by someone who had the access or the authority or the leverage to do it. The withdrawal was filed to close a case that someone needed closed, and Walter Greer did not file it. 18 months ago, he had filed the complaint. 4 months later, someone had closed it for him. 14 months after that, his heart stopped on a Wednesday morning, and the coroner took 40 minutes to sign off. I closed my laptop. The coffee shop was filling up around me. It was late afternoon, the after-work crowd starting to arrive with their coats and their tiredness and their ordinary lives. I sat in the middle of all of it, and I understood something that I had been not understanding for 2 weeks. I had been collecting pieces and telling myself they were not yet a picture, and now they were a picture, and I could not unsee it. He found something in the building's finances. Someone in the building's ownership structure found out he had found it. For 14 months he had been, living with it, deciding what to do, being watched, perhaps, having the feeling that someone had been in his apartment, losing his nerve, gaining it back, losing it again. 3 days before he died, he knocked on my door and started to say the thing and could not finish it. And then he was dead. And the coroner was done in 40 minutes. And Gareth Marsh was in the hallway with a locksmith before anyone from the family had arrived. And someone paid for the funeral before the family knew there was a funeral to pay for. And I had found his complaint in a public database, which meant that someone monitoring who was searching his name in regulatory databases would be able to find me. I went home. I made sure I locked my door. That night I could not work. I sat at my desk in the alcove, the desk I had built into the space because the alcove was the reason I had taken this apartment in the first place, and I stared at the wall to my left, which was the wall between 4A and 4B, and I listened. Silence. The building settling, the radiator doing its thing, the sound of the city outside, ambient and distant. I stayed at the desk until midnight. Then I went to bed and I did not sleep for a long time, and when I did, I slept badly, and at some point I was awake again and the room was dark, and the quality of the silence had changed. I lay still. Movement. On the other side of the wall. Not the radiator, not the pipes, not the building settling into itself in the way that old buildings do at 2 a.m. The specific, careful, weighted sound of a person in a space. A floorboard taking weight. The subtle shift of something being moved. Not loud, careful in fact. The careful of someone who is trying not to be heard. I looked at the clock. 1:47 a.m. 4B had been empty for 15 days. It had a new lock that I had watched a locksmith install. The family had not been there. They had not come, they had not cleared it. There was no reason for anyone to be inside it at 1:47 in the morning. I lay completely still and I counted. 4 minutes and approximately 20 seconds. Then the sound stopped. I waited. Nothing. I got up very carefully and went to my door and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. The door of 4B was closed. I watched it for 4 minutes and it did not move. I did not hear the elevator. I did not hear the stairwell door. I did not hear anything that would tell me where whoever had been in that apartment had gone. The hallway was empty and quiet, and the door of 4B was simply a closed door. I went back to bed. I did not go back to sleep. In the morning, I called down to the lobby and asked the building's front desk, a young man named Dev who was generally helpful and never asked why I was asking things, whether the elevator had been called to the 4th floor the previous night. He said he could check the log. The building had a digital system that tracked elevator calls by floor and time. He came back in a few minutes and said no, there had been no elevator call to the 4th floor between midnight and 6 a.m. No elevator call. I checked myself, later, by going down to the lobby and asking to see the log directly, which Dev showed me without hesitation. Nothing to the 4th floor. Nothing in the stairwell that I could access records for, because the building did not keep stairwell records. One exit through the lobby past the security camera in the corner above the mailboxes. I asked Dev if I could see the lobby footage from the previous night. He said he would have to check with Gareth about that. I said that was fine and I would follow up with Gareth. I followed up with Gareth that afternoon. I knocked on his office door on the ground floor. He was at his desk eating a sandwich and he looked up and smiled the way he smiles, that easy, building manager acknowledgement, and said hello and asked what he could do for me. I said I thought I had heard something the previous night and I was a little concerned and I wondered if I could look at the lobby camera footage from around 2 a.m. He said the camera had been offline for maintenance that week. I said, "Oh, when did the maintenance start?" He said he would have to check. He made a note. He said he would get back to me. He never got back to me. I went back upstairs, I sat at my desk. The wall to my left was the same wall it had always been. I put my hand flat against the plaster for a moment. I do not know why I did this exactly, except that it felt like the only gesture available. And then I took my hand back, and I sat with what I now understood. Someone had been in 4B at 1:47 in the morning. That person had not used the elevator. The lobby camera had been offline. Gareth Marsh had never applied this rekeying policy to any other vacant unit in 4 years. Gareth Marsh had been standing in the hallway with a locksmith before Walter Greer's family even knew there was a vacancy to manage. Gareth Marsh had access to that apartment. Gareth Marsh controlled the security camera. Gareth Marsh's building, or the ownership structure above Gareth Marsh's building, had been the subject of a regulatory complaint filed by the man who used to live in 4B. That complaint had been closed on the complainant's behalf. The complainant was now on the ground. Whoever was in 4B at 1:47 in the morning had not found what they were looking for, or they would not have been there. They were still looking. Whatever Walter had found, whatever documents or records or evidence that had informed a 4-paragraph formal complaint with specific references to financial instruments, some version of it was still somewhere. In the apartment, or they thought it might be in the apartment, or somewhere nearby. Okay, stop. Think. What do I have? A regulatory filing, public, attached to his name. A case number showing the complaint was closed with withdrawal he did not file. A rekeyed lock. A funeral paid for early. A lobby camera that was convenient offline. A building manager who never returned to me about camera maintenance. And his voice at my door. Maybe tomorrow. He had wanted to tell me. He had stood 3 feet away from me and started to say the thing, and his nerve had failed him, and he had said, maybe tomorrow, and gone back across the hall. He had chosen me, specifically. Across the hall me, the translator he had talked to once in a laundry room, because I was the closest person he trusted even marginally. Not the police, because maybe the local structure was the structure he was worried about. Not the regulatory body he had already tried, because that had not worked. Just a person across the hall who had laughed at his dry joke once and seemed precise. He had chosen me. He had stood at my door, and I had said, you can ask me anything, and he had said, maybe tomorrow, and I had gone back to my work. I sat at my desk, and I let that sit in me. Not the danger I could process, could think around, could begin to plan for. The other thing. The specific, quiet, unglamorous weight of, he tried. He stood at my door and he tried, and something stopped him, and now he was in the ground, and I was the only person who knew he had tried. This is the thing about knowing something no one else knows. It does not feel like power. It feels like a room you are locked in with a truth that has nowhere to go. He had been an ordinary man in an ordinary building who had found something he should not have found, and had spent months deciding what to do about it, and had finally decided to tell his neighbor. And his neighbor had said, you can ask me anything, and then the moment had passed, and then everything had passed. I thought about the laundry room, his laugh, the genuine warmth on his face when he was surprised by a person. I thought about a man who had lived in the same building for 11 years and had told me he was there because nobody asked questions, and whether that had been contentment or something else. Something more like relief at having found a place where he could be unremarkable long enough to feel safe. Whether safety was the thing he had been looking for all along. I sat at my desk for a long time that evening, not working, not moving particularly, holding what I was holding. There is a specific grief inside the fear that I want to name precisely, because it is not the same as fear, it is different from it, and it matters. The grief was for him. Not for the danger I was in, not for the situation I was navigating. For him. For a person I barely knew who had tried, once, at 11 p.m., to ask for help and had not been able to do it, and who was in the ground now with the thing he had tried to say still unsaid. That grief had to go somewhere. I let it sit for 3 full sentences in my own head. He tried. He was afraid and he tried anyway, and something stopped him, and now no one knew but me. That is a specific kind of lonely to die with, and he died with it, and I was not going to let that be the end of it. Then I got up and made tea and sat back down and started to plan. The next morning, Gareth knocked on my door. Not the buzzer, the door. He had not done this in 4 years. I have lived here 4 years, and Gareth has slid notices under my door and buzzed up when there was a package, and that is the extent of our door-adjacent relationship. The knock was 3 solid knocks, the knock of someone who is not uncertain about knocking. I looked through the peephole first. Gareth, in his building manager shirt, a clipboard in one hand. I looked at him for a moment. Then I opened the door. He said he was checking in with all the 4th-floor residents about some upcoming maintenance. He was pleasant. He had the clipboard, and he glanced at it occasionally, as if it contained 4th-floor maintenance-related information. He said the building would be doing some work on the heating system in the next few weeks, and there might be brief disruptions. I said that was good to know. He said, and this was the part I was waiting for, the reason he had come, dressed up as pleasantry. He said he was sorry about my neighbor. He said it must have been a difficult few weeks. He said the family had been in touch and had decided, given the distance, not to come themselves, and had asked the building to handle the clearance of the apartment. He said this was sometimes easier for families. He said it as if he were sharing a gentle piece of logistical information. He smiled the way he smiles. I said that made sense. I said I hoped the family was managing all right. I said maintenance disruptions were no problem. I thanked him for letting me know. He left. I closed my door. I stood in my own hallway, not moving, and I understood that the maintenance visit was not about maintenance. He had come to take a reading, to see how I was, to see whether I had questions, to see what registered on my face when he mentioned the apartment clearance. The family had asked the building to handle it. This was the timeline he needed me to have. The family was far away. The building was going to clear 4B. Whatever was still in that apartment that had sent someone through the stairwell at 1:47 in the morning would be gone before anyone else could access it. I had a window. I did not know how long the window was. I needed to do something before it closed. I did not go to the local police. I want to be precise about why. It was not instinct. It was the specific logic of what I knew. The regulatory complaint had been filed with an oversight body and had been closed with a forged withdrawal. Someone with access to that process, or with influence over it, had done that. The local police department and the local building authority and the local oversight structure were all, to some degree, the local structure. Walter Greer had tried the local structure, and the local structure had closed his complaint in 4 months without acting on it. Going to the local police with what I had, a rekeyed lock, an offline camera, a woman at a funeral who stared too long, was how you ended up with a notation in a file and a phone call to Gareth Marsh that you did not authorize. What I had was documentation. The complaint filing, public, with its case number. The closure record, with the forged withdrawal. The elevator log gap. The conversation with the woman at the funeral home, written out in full from memory. The timeline of the rekeyed lock and the camera maintenance. The knock at my door and what he said and when he said it. Individually, these were almost nothing. Together, they were the outline of something that a person whose job it was to look at outlines of things would recognize. I am a translator. My job is to make a thing that exists in one form legible in another form. I needed to translate what I knew into a form that would be legible to people who could act on it. I sat down at my desk. I opened a new document, and I began to write. Not a letter, a formal submission. In the language of regulatory documents, which I know well, because I have spent years working in that language, the structure, the precision, the specific habit of stating only what can be supported and supporting everything stated. I wrote the complaint in the form of a complaint, not in the form of a neighbor who was frightened, because complaints in the form of frightened neighbors get filed in the same drawer as complaints in the form of general concern. I needed this to be specific enough that a case officer would see the case number for Walter's original complaint and pull the file before they did anything else. I wrote for 4 hours. I read it back 3 times. I changed 14 words. Then I submitted it through the regulatory body's official online portal, with my name and my address and the case number attached. And I sat back in my chair and looked at the wall. The wall did not look different. The apartment did not feel different. I had just attached my name to something that connected me formally to an investigation into the building where I lived, and the ownership structure above it, and the possible circumstances of my neighbor's death. I had made myself, as documentation, the person who knew. I opened a new browser tab. The journalist had written 8 pieces in the past 2 years about financial irregularities in residential property management, shell companies, improperly disclosed ownership structures, the specific techniques by which money moves through buildings and arrives somewhere other than where it is supposed to arrive. The pieces were good, specific, careful, sourced. Her email was on the publication's website. I wrote to her. 2 paragraphs, with the case number and a summary of what I had submitted to the regulator. I attached the regulatory filing. I said, I don't know if this is useful. I sent it before I could talk myself out of it. Then I did the thing that cost me. I went to my bedroom and I got my bag from the top of the wardrobe. A soft-sided bag, the one I take when I travel for work, which is not often, but often enough that I keep it packed with the basics. I added my laptop, my hard drive, the specific documents I needed to keep working, a week's worth of other things. Then I called my friend Sadia, who lives 4 hours away and does not ask certain kinds of questions, which is one of the reasons I have known her for 12 years. I said, I need to come for a week. She said, of course, come tonight. I said, I'll be there by 10. She said, I'll leave the key. I did not tell Gareth Marsh I was going. I did not leave a note. I took my bag and my laptop and I took the stairs. The first time I had taken the stairs in 4 years. And I went out through the lobby, and I did not look at the camera in the corner above the mailboxes, the one that had been offline for maintenance, and I walked to the bus stop, and I did not look back at the building. The bus ride was 4 hours. I sat in a window seat and watched the city become suburbs, become something else, and I held my bag on my lap instead of putting it in the overhead rack. And I thought about a question I had been not asking myself for a week. What actually killed him? His heart stopped. That was real. The mechanism of his death was cardiac. What the coroner did not investigate was what caused the mechanism. A man of 63 who eats badly and does not exercise is a man whose cardiac history can be explained in ways that do not require explanation. He was the ideal candidate for a death that nobody looks at twice. If someone with access to his apartment, someone who had, for 11 years, had the master key to every unit in the building, who had rekeyed the lock before the family arrived, who had been in the apartment at 1:47 in the morning 2 weeks after the death. If that person had been in his apartment before the death, not after, then the question of how his heart stopped becomes a different kind of question. I did not have an answer to this question. I did not have the expertise to investigate it. What I had done was pass everything I had to people whose job it was to investigate it. The regulatory body, the journalist. That was the extent of what I could do, and I had done it, and whether anything came of it was not in my hands. That understanding took a long time to settle. I am someone who finishes things. I work through problems until they resolve, not because I am exceptional at solving problems, but because the feeling of an unresolved thing is intolerable to me in a way that the effort of resolution is not. Letting go of this while it was still open required a specific kind of decision that I had to make more than once on the bus that night. I made it. I let the city go past the window and I made it. Sadia had left a lamp on in the front window. I let myself in with the key under the mat and I went to the room she keeps for guests, which smells like the lavender she puts in the closets, and I put my bag down and I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment and I thought about Walter Greer in the laundry room, laughing. I stayed at Sadia's for 8 days, not 7. She asked nothing. She fed me. On the 4th day, she sat down across from me at the kitchen table and said, "Whenever you're ready." And that was the end of it. I was not ready until the 8th day, and then I was, and I went home. The response from the regulatory body came 3 weeks later. An email, formal, with a reference number. The case had been reopened. A case officer was assigned. I was asked to provide a formal statement. I provided it the following Thursday. 2 hours in a building downtown, an office with the particular carpet of government buildings, a case officer named Chen who was precise and did not waste words and who took notes in a way that suggested she was going to do something with them. She asked me about the elevator log. She asked me about the funeral home conversation. She asked about the timing of the lock change. She did not ask me what I thought had happened to Walter Greer, which told me she already had a theory and was not going to contaminate her investigation by sharing it with me. When we were done, she shook my hand and said my submission had been detailed and useful. She said these things take time. She said I had done the right thing in documenting everything in writing as I went. I said, I'm a translator. Writing things down precisely is what I do. She almost smiled at that. Almost. The journalist wrote back on a Tuesday. 3 lines. She was looking into it. She would be in touch. Please do not post anything about this online. I wrote back, I won't. She did not write again for 6 weeks, and when she did, it was to say she was still looking, and could she call me with some follow-up questions. And I said yes. That call lasted an hour and 20 minutes, and she asked about things I had not included in the submission, which meant she had found other things from other directions, which meant I was not the only person who had been looking. I do not know what she published. By the time anything would have been published, I had already given my notice to the building management, not to Gareth directly, through the formal email address for tenancy matters, and I was packing. My lease had 9 months left when all of this happened. I waited until the end of it. 3 months of going in and out of the building, nodding to Gareth in the lobby the way you nod in lobbies, saying good morning and thank you for the maintenance notice and, yes, I'll be sure to leave access for the heating work. 3 months of walking past the door of 4B every time I came home, watching it become what it was going to become. The new tenants moved in on a Friday in late spring. I saw them in the elevator. A young couple, her arms full of a large plant, him carrying a box that was clearly heavier than he had estimated. They smiled at me in that new neighbor way, the way of people who are in the middle of something good and extend the feeling outward toward available strangers. I smiled back. She said the plant was going to need a lot of sun, and she was hoping the windows faced the right direction. I said I thought the east-facing rooms got good morning light. We rode up to the 4th floor together. They got off and I followed, and they went to 4B and she put her key in the new lock. The lock that Gareth had installed the afternoon I came home from a funeral, with lake wind still on my coat. And the door opened, and they went inside with their boxes and their plant, and the door closed behind them. I stood in the hallway for a moment. The door of 4B was a door. Behind it, a couple arranging their things, figuring out where the light was. In the morning, they would walk past this door and not think about it. They would learn the rhythm of the building, the elevator, the radiator, the way sounds travel through walls. They would nod at their neighbors. They might find, in a year or two, that the neighbor across the hall was someone worth talking to. I did not tell them anything. I have asked myself whether I should have, and I have come back to the same answer every time. What I had to tell them was already in the hands of a regulatory body and a journalist, which was where it needed to be, not in the hallway from a woman with a bag over her shoulder on her last day in the building. They deserved to begin without carrying what I had been carrying. They could find their own way to whatever this building was. I went back into my apartment and finished packing the last of my boxes. The case officer sent a follow-up email 4 months later, not with conclusions, with the notification that the matter was proceeding and that I might be contacted again if additional information was needed. I wrote back and said I understood. She wrote, "Thank you for your patience and your precision in this matter." Precision. I thought about that word for a while. It is the thing Walter Greer had exercised in that 4-paragraph complaint. The specific, measured language of a man who knew how to document things and had documented carefully. He had been precise. He had been careful. He had found something true and written it down in the correct language and filed it in the correct place. And it had been taken from him by someone with enough access to close it before anyone looked. He tried to tell me. He stood at my door with his hands in his pockets, and he tried and something stopped him. Nerves, probably. The specific fear of bringing something dangerous close to someone who did not know it was coming. And he said, maybe tomorrow. And tomorrow did not come. What I keep is this. He chose tomorrow, not never. Not I shouldn't have come. Not forget it. He said maybe tomorrow, which is the language of a person who has not given up, who has decided to try again with more nerve, who needs one more night to gather what he needs to say what he knows. He was going to try again. He did not get the chance. The regulatory case is still open as far as I know. I do not follow it closely. I gave what I had to the people who needed it, and I made a decision that the rest was not mine to carry. I am not a detective. I am a translator who noticed something and wrote it down precisely and passed it to the right hands. Whether those hands do what needs to be done with it, I don't know. I decided not to know. Some decisions you have to make on a bus at night, watching the city become something else outside a dark window, and then you have to keep making them every time the thought comes back. The question of who was in 4B at 1:47 in the morning. I have a theory. I have had the same theory for a long time. I cannot prove it. I have decided that I have done what I could do and that the theory belongs with Chen and the journalist now, not with me. The thread stays open. I know it stays open. I have made my peace with that, more or less, which is different from having made my peace with everything, which I have not. But more or less. Some threads do not close. Some things that were started get finished by someone else or get finished in a way you are not present for. And you learn to live in the not knowing, and you go somewhere else, and you leave a lamp on. Walter left one thing I cannot stop thinking about. In the laundry room, during the 20 minutes we were really talking, he said, at some point, that the thing about his work that he had missed after retiring was the precision of it. The way financial documents did not lie if you read them correctly. The way numbers had to balance. He said, I liked that about it. The way a thing could be true or false and you could always find out which. He found out which. He found out the true thing underneath the false thing, and it cost him what it cost him. And the only part I can stand about any of this is the part where he tried, once, at 11 p.m., to give it to someone else. The part where he stood at my door and said, I need to ask you something. He asked. He almost asked. That counts for something. I have decided it counts for something. It is not enough, and it is not nothing, and I am still deciding, every day, where in between those two things it sits.